She paid just $500 for an old 1943 Piper Cub, rusted, weather-worn, and forgotten in a barn. Grace Whitaker, a small-town female mechanic, thought she was buying a simple restoration project. But when the original pilot's father showed up at her hangar, everything changed. What began as a mission to restore a vintage plane quickly turned into an emotional, true story of legacy, healing, and a promise that only she could fulfill. This is how one female mechanic restores a vintage plane and, in doing so, brings a fallen pilot's dream back to life. But before we dive in, tell us, where are you watching from? We love seeing our global family in the comments. Let's get started. 2 weeks earlier, the dawn light spilled across the dusty windows of Willow Creek Aero Works, a run-down airplane hangar tucked into the far edge of a forgotten airfield in rural Montana. That's where Grace Whitaker, 127, unlocked the padlock and slid open the groaning hangar doors. Half the overhead lights flickered. The other half were dead. She hadn't fixed them, couldn't afford to, and somehow, their dim glow felt fitting. The place used to belong to her grandfather, a crop duster pilot and grease-covered dreamer. After he passed, Grace stayed behind to keep the business alive, even if business was almost none. Her friends had moved on. The town had shrunk. But this hangar, it was home. Every oil stain on the concrete floor held a memory. Every socket wrench still had her grandfather's grip on it. She made her morning coffee in a rusted thermos older than she was, listening to the silence of dreams people forgot to chase. That Thursday, a man walked in carrying a beat-up flight bag and a folder thicker than a phone book. "There's a 1943 Piper Cub sitting in a barn outside of town," he said, voice low. "She's yours for $500. And if you can haul her..." Grace didn't blink. Maybe it was time she rebuilt something for herself. The Piper Cub arrived the next afternoon, strapped down on a rust-covered flatbed truck that groaned like it was carrying a piece of the past. The fuselage was faded to a sickly yellow-gray, with streaks of rust crawling along its seams like vines reclaiming an old barn. One of the wings sagged slightly, patched with mismatched fabric. The cockpit canopy was cracked, and the tires looked like they hadn't felt movement since the Cold War. Grace stood in the doorway of the hangar, arms crossed, squinting against the sun as the truck driver backed in. "You sure this thing's worth $500? He asked, more amused than skeptical. Grace didn't answer, because what she saw wasn't the peeling paint or the warped propeller. She saw her grandfather's hands, weathered and steady, guiding her tiny fingers across blueprints on a summer evening. She saw herself at 10, standing on a wooden crate to reach the engine cowling, giggling as he called her co-pilot. She didn't see a plane. She saw a heartbeat waiting to be revived. Once the truck pulled away, silence reclaimed the hangar, broken only by the soft ping of metal cooling in the breeze. Grace walked slowly toward the battered Piper, almost reverently. She placed her hand on the nose of the plane like she was greeting an old friend. The surface was cold, lifeless, but not hopeless. By nightfall, she had the seats pulled and the rotted flooring removed. The smell of mildew and thyme clung to everything. She found 2 empty soda bottles in the side pocket, a rusted screwdriver jammed behind the control yoke, and taped to the back of the cockpit a faded photo of a young man in a flight jacket, grinning like he'd just touched the clouds. Grace pinned the photo to her corkboard above her workbench. The next morning, she started with the engine. The old Continental A65 had seen better days, probably in another century. Pistons frozen, spark plugs shattered, rats had nested in the cowling. She sighed and muttered, "You're going to make me fight for every inch of this, huh?" That's when the bell on the hangar door jingled. She wiped her hands on her coveralls and turned. An older man stood there. 60s, maybe early 70s. He wore well-worn boots and a faded bomber jacket zipped halfway up. His hair was more silver than gray, and his expression carried that hard-to-place combination of steel and sorrow. His eyes found the plane behind her, and something in his shoulders shifted. "That her?" he asked, barely above a whisper. Grace nodded. "You the one who sold it?" He stepped forward slowly. "Name's Henry Lawson. That plane's been sitting in a barn on my family's land for over 20 years. Figured it was time to let her go." He looked around the hangar, then back at her. "Didn't expect someone like you to be the one to pick her up." Grace raised an eyebrow. "Someone like me?" Henry chuckled softly. "Young, female, knows what she's doing?" Grace smirked. "Guilty on all counts." He smiled, but just barely. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila envelope. "Figured you might want this. Her story. Logbooks, maintenance notes, photos, letters." He paused, his eyes scanning the Piper like it was more ghost than machine. "My son, Luke. He flew that plane. Saved up for her. Spent 2 years restoring her with me. Bolt by bolt." Grace's breath caught. What happened to him? Henry's jaw clenched. His gaze dropped to the floor. He took a long moment before answering. "Afghanistan, 2005. He was a medevac pilot. Didn't make it home." Silence settled between them, thick and sacred. Henry stepped forward and gently set the envelope on Grace's workbench. His hand lingered there for a moment. "I couldn't bear to touch her after that," he said, eyes glistening but not breaking. "Covered her up. Let time take her." He motioned toward the Piper Cub. "Thought maybe someone would come along who saw more than rust." Grace swallowed hard. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He shook his head. "Don't be. I think maybe I was waiting for the right person, someone who'd hear the echo, not just the engine." And just like that, 2 strangers stood in the middle of a quiet hangar, no longer strangers. 2 people bound by loss, and the faint hope of rebuilding something sacred. "I'll do right by her," Grace said, voice low but certain. Henry nodded slowly. "I believe you will." Then, as he turned to leave, he paused. "Oh," he said, reaching into his pocket one last time. He pulled out a key, the kind with edges worn smooth by years of turning over more than engines. "She still needs this." He placed it in her hand, curled her fingers around it, then walked out without another word. Grace stood there for a long while, not moving, just holding the key and feeling the weight of everything it meant. That night, long after the Montana sky had gone dark and the pines outside had started whispering with the wind, Grace sat alone at her workbench. The old key Henry had placed in her hand now lay next to her dented coffee mug, alongside the manila envelope he'd left behind. She hadn't opened it yet. Somehow, she felt like she needed to wait. Not out of fear, but respect. The envelope carried something heavier than paper, a legacy. The hangar lights hummed quietly above, casting a warm glow on the dust motes floating in the air. Outside, the silence was thick, broken only by the hum of cicadas and the occasional creak of wind through metal. Finally, with hands that were not yet steady, Grace unfastened the string holding the envelope shut. Inside, she found time folded into layers. There were logbooks, entries scribbled in 2 different handwritings, father and son, old Polaroids of a younger Henry, shirtless and grinning, holding a wrench beside his son. Luke, who had the same eyes, the same determined smile. There were pages of diagrams, hand-marked with changes they'd made together. Notes tucked into margins jokes, reminders, questions. And at the very bottom, a single letter. It was addressed to the next pilot. Grace's breath caught as she unfolded the paper. To the next pilot. If you're reading this, then you found her. Or maybe she's found you. This plane isn't perfect. She's not fast. Not pretty. But she's alive. She's got a soul stitched into every seam and screw. My dad and I, we rebuilt her from the bones up. 2 summers of swearing, sweat, and laughter. Flying her felt like flying with him even when I was alone. I don't know who you are, or what you're running from, or chasing. But if you're fixing her, please, don't just bring her back to factory. Make her yours. Paint her wild. Swap the panel. Leave a mark. These old birds aren't just about the sky. They're about stories. Oh, and if you find something odd under the pilot's seat that was on purpose, keep it or pass it on. Whatever feels right. Thank you for giving her another flight. Luke Lawson. Grace didn't move. Didn't breathe. Her fingers rested gently on the letter, and she read it again, then again. Each line was a whisper from someone long gone, but never lost. She stood slowly and walked back into the hangar. The plane sat quiet in the center, its battered wings tucked like folded arms. She circled to the side, climbed into the empty cockpit, and reached beneath the pilot's seat. Most planes that age didn't hide much underneath maybe a few loose bolts or dust. But Grace's fingers brushed something solid. She pulled back the carpet and pried at the metal flooring with a screwdriver. Something shifted. Her heart pounded. She reached in and pulled out a small, weathered tin box, sealed with layers of black electrical tape. It felt heavy in her hands, not just with weight, but with meaning. Back at the workbench, she carefully peeled the tape away. The lid gave with a soft pop, releasing the faintest smell of oil and old leather. Inside were 3 things. A dog tag, scratched and worn, with Luke Lawson's name and blood type etched faintly into the steel. A flash drive, labeled in faded marker flight plan for her. And a check folded, yellowed with age, but still crisp enough to read. Grace opened it. $22,000, made out to cash. Dated June 10th, 2005. Memo line for upgrades. Her knees almost gave out. She stared at the numbers, the signature, the message. The check had never been cashed. The money had never been spent. Luke had saved it for the plane, for the dream, and never made it back to use it. The next morning, Grace picked up the phone and called Henry. He answered on the first ring. She told him about the box, her voice shaking, told him about the dog tag, the flash drive, the check. There was silence on the other end of the line for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, broken. I thought it was gone. He said he showed it to me the week before his last deployment. Said we'd install a new nav system when he got home. Said we'd fly to Alaska together, just to say we did. Grace closed her eyes. I searched that plane for weeks. Henry continued. Glove box, cargo bay, tool bins. I stopped looking eventually. I guess I wasn't ready to find it. Grace didn't know what to say, so she asked gently, "What do you want me to do with it?" The pause on the other end was long. Then Henry exhaled, the sound trembling like a sigh lost in time. Do what he asked. He said, "Make her yours." And just like that, a forgotten Piper Cub was no longer just a restoration project. It was a mission, a conversation carried forward, a promise reborn, not just for Grace, but for every hand that had ever touched that plane and every heart that had ever dreamed of flying. The morning after she found the tin box, Grace arrived at the hangar before sunrise. The cold air bit at her cheeks as she unlocked the door and stepped inside. She didn't flip on the lights. Didn't start the coffee pot. Didn't even put on gloves. She just stood there silent, staring at the Piper Cub. It looked the same cracked canopy, same faded paint, same wing slightly bowed from time and weather. But it felt different now. This wasn't just a machine anymore. It was a message in metal, a kind of time capsule sealed in rivets and rubber. It carried a story, trapped between the bolts and bearings, a bond between a father and son who rebuilt it together, a dream left half-finished in a war zone. And somehow, across years and silence and grief, it had landed in her hands. Grace walked to the workbench, picked up Luke's dog tag, and held it tightly. It was warm from where her hand had slept beside it all night. She slipped it onto her keyring, letting it rest beside the old ignition key Henry had given her. It felt right, like carrying a compass, or a memory you didn't want to forget. Then, for the first time, she plugged in the flash drive. It took a moment to load an old USB, hesitant and glitchy, but eventually, a single folder blinked onto her screen. Final flight plan. Inside were PDFs, scanned notes, blueprints, and hand-drawn diagrams. Some were crude, scratched on graph paper with coffee stains in the corners. Others were sophisticated, computer-rendered CAD files with labeled dimensions. Luke hadn't just dreamed about finishing the plane, he had designed it. A new control panel layout, reinforced wing struts, a custom lightweight seat design, even a color palette file labeled Lawson Blue Sky Metallic. 40% brightened. Grace let out a soft breath. Half awe, half ache. He had it all planned, down to the paint code. And now, it was hers. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the computer screen, the dog tag swaying gently from her fingers. A creeping wave of doubt slipped over her like cold fog. She was good with engines. She could tear down a prop assembly blindfolded. But avionics, rewiring, custom airframe mods, flight balance adjustments? This was another level. She thought about Henry, about Luke, about the check still tucked inside the tin box, and about the letter. Don't just bring her back to factory. Make her yours. That line rang in her chest like a bell. Maybe it wasn't about perfection. Maybe it was about intention. She picked up her notepad and scribbled across the top. Project Lawson Phase 1 underneath. She wrote, "Clean the frame. Remove the rot. Listen to her." And that's exactly what she did. Over the next week, the hangar transformed. Grace stripped the fuselage down to bare bones. She sanded the rust until her fingers cramped. She spoke to the plane, not out loud, but in that quiet, sacred way that mechanics and musicians do, where each sound means something if you're listening right. And the plane responded. The propeller loosened after a day of coaxing. The wiring gave up its secrets inch by inch. The old engine, once solid as stone, began to yield beneath her touch. Word got out faster than she expected. First came Pete, the old crop duster pilot who lived down the road. He dropped off a set of new wheel bearings and a box of donuts, saying, "Heard you're working on something worth remembering." Then came Marla, her former aviation instructor, who rolled up her sleeves and started degreasing the magnetos without even asking. By the end of the second week, she had an unofficial crew. Eli, a high school senior who wanted to be an aircraft mechanic and showed up every day after class. Don, a retired Air Force engineer who used to rebuild fighter jets in the 80s. And even Pastor Green, who stopped by weekly just to polish the cowling and pray over the engine. They didn't come because they loved old planes. They came because they saw what Grace was doing, not restoring a machine, but finishing a conversation that war had interrupted. Grace found herself changing, too. For years, she'd worked in silence, head down, just trying to survive, fixing whatever flew or rolled into her hangar. But this was purpose. She woke up with fire in her chest. Her hands were always calloused, her coveralls always stained, but her heart full. Every bolt she turned was a step forward. Every piece she replaced felt like healing for the plane, for the family that had lost its son, and maybe for herself. One night, after everyone had gone home and the tools were quiet, Grace climbed into the cockpit. Still bare metal, no gauges, no seat cushion. She gripped the control stick and stared through the cracked canopy. The moonlight spilled across the hangar floor like a silver runway. She whispered, "We're gonna finish this. You and me." And in that stillness, Grace Whitaker understood something she hadn't before. She wasn't just rebuilding an airplane. She was reclaiming a legacy. She wasn't fixing a thing. She was giving it back its voice. By mid-April, the Piper Cub no longer looked like something left behind. The fabric skin had been replaced and hand-stitched with care. The frame gleamed under a fresh coat of primer. The engine rebuilt piece by piece with Dawn's steady hands, and Eli's boundless curiosity purred like a lullaby. Steady and deep. And the color? Lawson blue. A custom metallic sky blue paint. Exactly as Luke had imagined it, only brighter. Almost hopeful. Grace had sprayed it herself, alone in the hangar one morning as the sun rose. Each layer felt like sealing a promise. One Saturday afternoon, Grace was adjusting the new altimeter when the door creaked open behind her. A tall man in a flannel shirt and camera harness stepped inside, blinking against the sun. "You Grace Whitaker?" he asked, squinting. She wiped her hands on a rag. Wary. "Depends on who's asking." He held up a business card. Darren Mays, feature writer, Aviation Spirit magazine. "Someone sent us a few photos of your hangar. And that cub?" He walked forward slowly, reverently, as if stepping into a church. "I came to see if the story was real." Grace raised an eyebrow. "What story?" Darren smiled. "Girl finds forgotten plane, learns it belonged to a fallen soldier, restores it with half the town, builds a new life in the process." She snorted. "Sounds prettier than it felt." "Yeah. Well," he said, adjusting his camera. "The good ones always do." Darren spent the afternoon quietly walking the hangar, snapping pictures of the blueprints, the rivets, the dog tag still hanging from the ignition key. He talked to Marla, to Dawn, to Pastor Green. He took a group photo of Grace and her crew, standing proudly in front of the Lawson blue Piper Cub, like a strange little family stitched together by oil and memory. Then he pulled out a folder. "We're running a feature next month, Legacy Flyers. Planes with heart. People with purpose. Your story's the centerpiece. 8 pages. Cover shot. Full interview." Grace stared at him, caught between disbelief and mild panic. "Wait, cover." He nodded. "And we'd like to fly you out to our convention in Denver. Put you on a panel. Let you tell this story in your own words." Grace opened her mouth. Nothing came out. She looked down at her hands, greasy, cracked, still stained faintly with primer. These weren't magazine hands. She wasn't a speaker. She was just a girl from Willow Creek who happened to have a wrench in one hand and a ghost of someone else's dream in the other. "Why me?" she asked, genuinely. Darren shrugged. "Because this isn't just about a plane. It's about what we pass down, what we leave unfinished, and the people brave enough to pick it up again." His words echoed in her chest like Luke's letter. "Don't just restore her to factory. Make her yours." Maybe this was part of making her truly hers. 2 weeks later, Grace stood under spotlights at the Denver Aviation Convention. The Piper Cub, now gleaming in Lawson blue, was displayed behind her on a rotating platform, its tail number restored. Its dog tag still hanging proudly from the ignition switch. Darren introduced her as the mechanic who rebuilt more than a plane. Grace gripped the mic like a torque wrench and began, She told them about the envelope, about Henry Lawson, about Luke's letter, the dog tag, the flash drive, the check. She spoke about fear, doubt, failure, about sanding until her knuckles bled, about crying at 2 a.m., alone in the hangar with nothing but a socket set and grief she didn't even know was hers. And then she told them about hope, about the moment the engine turned over for the first time, about the way people showed up not to help her, but to honor something, about finding a rhythm in the work, a meaning in the mess. I used to think I was just fixing broken things, she said, her voice cracking, but now I know I was rebuilding something sacred. The room was silent. Then it rose, like thunder rolling across a runway, applause that shook something loose inside her, something she'd been holding for too long. After the convention, she got offers, sponsorships, book deals, even a reality show pitch called Wing and Wrench. She turned down most of them. She didn't need fame. She had something better. A hangar filled with light, a group of people who believed in her, and the quiet certainty that she'd honored a promise. That she hadn't just restored a plane, she'd given a soldier's dream a second flight. Back home in Willow Creek, life didn't slow down after Denver. If anything, it surged forward like a propeller, finally finding full throttle. The day after the convention, Grace opened the hangar like she always had. Same flickering lights, same chipped coffee mug, same wind howling softly through the rafters. But everything felt different. She walked in not as the girl who barely scraped by, but as someone who had earned her place, not through fame, not through luck, but through grit, and grief, and grace. The Piper Cub sat at the front of the hangar, polished weekly by Eli, who now proudly called it the town's wings. People came to see it, not just aviation nuts, but veterans, widows, fathers with sons, daughters with dreams. They didn't come for horsepower. They came for what the plane represented. Grace had changed, too. Her shoulders stood straighter, her voice steadier. She started taking on rebuilds that no one else would touch: barn finds, rust heaps, planes half swallowed by time. She didn't see wrecks anymore. She saw stories waiting to be rescued. She hired Eli full-time, taught him how to weld a patch panel without burning through the skin, helped Marla launch a Girls Who Fly class at the high school shop. And then, one windy Tuesday afternoon, just before closing, Henry Lawson came back. No call, no warning, just the creak of the hangar door and the sound of boots on concrete. Grace looked up from under the wing of a Cessna and froze. He hadn't changed much, same bomber jacket, same quiet eyes, but the weight he carried. It was different now. Lighter, or maybe more centered. She smiled, brushing a smudge of grease from her cheek. Back for a test flight. Henry didn't answer right away. He walked past her, straight to the Lawson blue Piper Cub. He ran a hand along the wing, then around to the door, then paused at the step. Grace handed him the keys without a word. He climbed in slowly, as if entering a memory. When the engine turned over, it filled the hangar with that deep, familiar hum. The sound wasn't just mechanical, it was emotional. Henry closed his eyes and whispered, "I can hear him in here." They didn't talk much after that. They didn't need to. He taxied the Cub around the airstrip once, then returned and shut her down. When he stepped out, he held the key for a long time, then pressed it back into Grace's palm. But this time, his hand lingered on hers, and his voice, though rough, was steady. "You gave me something I didn't know I needed. Closure." Grace nodded, too full to speak. He left with a single nod and a tear that never quite fell. Weeks passed. Spring warmed into early summer. The hangar buzzed with energy: new students, new planes, new purpose. Grace no longer woke up dreading the day. She woke up alive. But then, one evening, near closing, a package arrived. No return address, just her name, written in a shaky hand. Inside was a letter, and a photo. The letter was from a woman named Margaret Lawson, Luke's mother. She had read the magazine article, seen the photos, watched Grace's speech on a grainy YouTube video someone had uploaded, and she wanted to thank her for bringing my son's dream back into the world. The letter read, "For doing what grief never allowed me to do, see his joy, not just his absence." The photo was of Luke, standing next to the Piper Cub, in full flight gear, grinning like the sky itself belonged to him. But taped to the back of the photo was a note in Luke's handwriting. "First solo flight. Told Mom I was scared. She said, 'Anything that scares you is probably worth doing.'" Grace's hands shook. She pressed the photo to her chest and sat quietly for a long time, the hangar dark around her, the only light coming from the plane. Later that night, she hung the photo next to the blueprint wall, right beside the framed letter from Luke. It made her think, all this time, she'd been fixing something, restoring, honoring, rebuilding. But in truth, she had become the thing that was restored. Not just her confidence, not just her purpose, but her capacity to hope. One Sunday morning, Grace held her first official Flight and Faith open hangar day. Veterans, kids, families, people who didn't know the first thing about airplanes but came anyway. They touched the Lawson Cub with reverence, asked about the dog tag, asked about the blue paint. And Grace told them. She told the whole story, again and again. By noon, she'd lost her voice, but her heart had never been louder. It was a warm September afternoon when Grace Whitaker rolled the Lawson Blue Piper Cub out of the hangar, not to tune it, not to test it, but simply to feel it. The engine hummed softly beneath the cowling, the kind of hum that didn't demand attention but carried weight. The wind danced across the wings, and the sunlight kissed the polished blue paint until it shimmered like memory made visible. She climbed in, hands steady, heart full. And for the first time, she didn't feel like she was flying someone else's dream. She felt like she was flying with it. Grace taxied slowly toward the old grass airstrip at the edge of Willow Creek. It wasn't much, just a narrow field that hadn't seen a flight in years. But the locals had trimmed it up for her, fixed the lights, even painted fresh lines along the edges. One little girl had drawn a chalk heart at the end of the runway and written in pink for the soldier in the sky. Grace saw it as she lined up for takeoff, and her eyes filled. She took a deep breath. Then she pushed the throttle forward. The Cub responded instantly, graceful, alive, and eager. The wheels lifted off the earth, and within seconds, Grace was airborne. She flew low over Willow Creek, over the school where she'd fixed a broken door hinge with duct tape and instinct, over the diner where old men still talked about the plain girl, over the cemetery, where a modest stone read, "Luke Henry Lawson, 1981, 2005, a soul too big for the ground." She circled once, then once more. She didn't look at the stone. She looked beyond it, at the sky, at the wind, at the space Luke never got to fly again. And she whispered, "We did it, Luke." Back at the hangar, the town had gathered. Eli held a radio and cheered as she landed. Marla wiped a tear behind her sunglasses. Henry stood off to the side, one hand in his pocket, the other clutched tightly around a folded handkerchief. Grace stepped out of the cockpit, hair wild from the wind, and someone no one quite remembers who started clapping. Then someone else joined, and another, until the hangar filled with the kind of applause that doesn't just honor effort, it honors transformation. Grace smiled through it, but something inside her cracked open, and through that crack, light poured in. In the weeks that followed, things changed, but not in the flashy, overnight success kind of way. In a quieter, deeper way. She launched a weekend program called Wings of Worth, offering basic flight training, aircraft maintenance classes, and mentoring especially for women, veterans, and kids who didn't think they belonged near a runway. She partnered with the local VA, donated old tools, rebuilt a Cessna with a teenage girl named Lily, whose brother had died overseas. One Saturday, a woman from out of state drove 4 hours just to sit in the Piper Cub for 5 minutes. She didn't say much, just ran her hand over the seat and whispered, "My husband flew one of these. Before." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Grace held her hand, then offered her the pilot's seat. And for a few sacred minutes, the woman sat there, eyes closed, breathing deeply as if flying didn't always need takeoff to begin. One evening, long after the tools had been put away and the hangar lights dimmed, Grace sat alone in the cockpit again. Outside, the Montana stars blinked awake. She looked at the framed letter from Luke, now hanging beside the cockpit door, read it once more, let the words settle like they always did. Then she reached up and touched the St. Christopher medal that now hung from the rearview mirror, swaying gently. She didn't cry. She didn't need to. Her heart was loud enough. She turned the key halfway just enough to hear the familiar click. Not to fly, just to remind herself it was still possible. Then she whispered, "You saved me, too. Because sometimes, it's not the sky that gives you freedom. It's the ground you learn to rise from. And sometimes, the story you think you're finishing turns out to be the one that starts your life." What Grace Whitaker learned through the Lawson Blue Piper Cub wasn't just about engines, flight plans, or rivets. It was about believing in broken things. The plane had been forgotten, abandoned, rusted through by time and grief, and so had parts of Grace. Grace didn't restore the plane to its factory condition. She restored it to something more honest, a vessel for memory, a symbol of healing, a flight fueled by purpose. Because we all carry pieces of someone else's unfinished story. The girl who once stood in the shadows of grief and broken wings had become the woman lifting others towards the sky. Because for Grace and for everyone she'll teach next, the runway isn't the end, it's where the story begins. The end. Up next, 2 more powerful true stories of purpose and transformation. Click to keep flying with us. And don't forget to subscribe if you believe dreams deserve a second chance.